In June 2024, something happened that almost no major news outlet covered. No press conference, no emergency meeting of finance ministers, no breaking news. Saudi Arabia simply let a 50-year arrangement with the United States quietly expire, and with it, the invisible architecture that has held up the global financial order since 1974. The system that made the US dollar untouchable, that let Washington borrow at will, that gave America the ability to sanction any country on earth, began slowly to come apart. Most people have never heard of the petrodollar, but it has shaped the price of everything they've ever bought. Before we can understand what's being lost, we need to understand what the petrodollar is. Well, to understand the petrodollar, we first need to understand the importance of oil, because oil is not just fuel. It is the circulatory system of the modern economy. It powers the ships that carries your goods across oceans. It goes into the plastic in your phone case, the fertilizer that grows your food, the tires on the car that brought you home. Our modern economy effectively depends on oil for everything. In 2024, the world consumed roughly 102 million barrels of oil every single day. Because demand for oil is constant and enormous, the global oil market is one of the largest in human history. Some countries like the US and Saudi Arabia produce a lot of it. Others use a lot but don't produce much like Japan and India. So how did the US dollar come to control the oil market? Well, in 1944, while Europe and Asia laid in ruins, representatives from 44 nations gathered in a small hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The war wasn't even over yet, but they were already designing what came next. The agreement they reached was straightforward. The United States dollar would become the anchor of the global financial system. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself would be pegged to gold, at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The logic was simple. America had emerged from the war with its factories untouched, its cities standing, and the largest gold reserves on the planet. If you needed a stable foundation for the global economy, the dollar was the obvious choice. For a generation, it worked. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency. Central banks around the globe held dollars. International trade was settled in dollars. The system functioned until it didn't. By the late 1960s, the United States was running massive deficits, funding a war in Vietnam, expanding domestic welfare programs, spending far more than it earned. Dollars were pouring out of America and into the world economy, and other countries, led by France, began doing the math. If the dollar was supposed to be backed by gold at $35 an ounce, and there were far more dollars circulating than there was gold in Fort Knox to redeem them, then the whole system was built on a promise America could no longer keep. French President Charles de Gaulle didn't just make this agreement publicly. He sent the French Navy across the Atlantic to New York Harbor to collect France's gold. Others followed. A run on U.S. gold reserves was underway. On August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon went on television and did something that would reshape the global financial order for the next half-century. He closed the gold window.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
In a single Sunday evening broadcast, Nixon had turned the US dollar into something entirely new. A fiat currency backed by nothing except the US government's promise to honor it. And here's what's remarkable. The dollar didn't collapse. Why? Well, because by 1971, the entire global economy was already built on dollars. Contracts were written in dollars. Trade was settled in dollars. Central banks held dollars. The infrastructure of the international financial system was so deeply dollar-denominated that switching wasn't a policy choice. It was a logical nightmare no one wanted to attempt. That said, this method was fragile. Without gold as its anchor, the dollar needed a new foundation, and it found one in the desert. In 1973, the world experienced the OPEC oil crisis. This was when Arab members of OPEC cut off oil exports to the United States and its allies in retaliation for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. Inflation skyrocketed. Petrol queues stretched around city blocks. Economies that had never seriously considered their energy vulnerability were suddenly on their knees. The crisis exposed something terrifying. The global economy ran on oil, and America didn't control the oil. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Riyadh. What was negotiated there was never made public as a single formal treaty. But the arrangement that emerged was, in practice, one of the most consequential deals in modern history. The deal was simple. Saudi Arabia, the largest oil producer in OPEC, would sell its oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, America would provide military protection, sell weapons to the kingdom, and guarantee its security. The other OPEC members, watching Riyadh's lead, largely fell into line. The dollar had found its new anchor: oil. And thus the petrodollar system was born. The logic is simple. If every country needs oil, and oil is sold in dollars, then every country needs dollars. Take Japan. Japan produces almost no oil, but its factories, its transport networks, its entire economy runs on it. To buy that oil, Japan must first obtain US dollars. And Japan is not alone. Every country that powers a factory, fuels a plane, or runs a logistics network faces the same constraint. The result is a permanent structural demand for American currency, quietly built into the daily functioning of the global economy. That demand gave the U.S. something extraordinary. It kept the dollar strong. It allowed Washington to borrow more cheaply than any other government on earth. And it gave America the power to weaponize its financial system. Because when nearly every international transaction flows through U.S. banks, access to those banks becomes leverage. Now, the oil producers, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, didn't just pile up cash. They invested it. They invested it into U.S. government bonds, into American real estate and companies, essentially back into the very financial system that had generated those dollars in the first place. Economists call this petrodollar recycling, and for 50 years it functioned as a permanent subsidy to the American economy. Economist Barry Eichengreen called it the exorbitant privilege. The phrase was originally coined by a French finance minister, Charles de Gaulle's treasury chief, who watched American dollars flood into Europe and understood exactly what was happening. America could run deficits that would have bankrupted any other country. It could borrow at lower interest rates than anyone else. It could print money and export the inflation to the rest of the world, because everyone else had to absorb those dollars to buy oil. Eichengreen put it simply: it costs a few cents to print a $100 bill, but other countries had to produce $100 worth of real goods to obtain one. That asymmetry, that quiet, invisible tax on the rest of the world, is what the petrodollar built and sustained. So why, after 50 years, is this system dying? Well, it's not because of one dramatic event, but because the foundations underneath it are shifting. Start with Saudi Arabia. The original arrangement was built on mutual dependency. Saudi Arabia needed American military protection. America needed Saudi oil. But the U.S. shale revolution rewrote the equation. America is now the world's largest oil producer and a net exporter. It no longer needs Saudi oil the way it once did. And Saudi Arabia's largest customer is now China, accounting for more than 20% of the kingdom's exports. The relationship that anchored the entire system no longer looks the way it did in 1974. Then there is the question of alternatives. For decades, countries frustrated with dollar dominance had nowhere else to go. The euro was regional. The yuan was tightly controlled. Gold was inert. Frustration had no outlet. But that is no longer entirely true. And we'll come to what is being built in a moment. But perhaps the most consequential shift happened in 2022, and most people missed its full significance. When the United States and its G7 allies froze $300 billion worth of Russian central bank reserves, it was an unprecedented attack of economic warfare. And it sent a quiet, unmistakable message to every central bank on the planet. Dollar reserves are not safe. If Washington decides your government is a threat, your money can be taken. The effect was the opposite of what was intended. Rather than deterring adversaries, it accelerated the very diversification that American policymakers feared. Central banks began buying gold at the fastest pace, over 2,000 tons in 2023 and 2024 combined. Here's the question that should be obvious by now, but rarely gets asked directly. If the petrodollar system benefits America at the expense of everyone else, why do countries that openly oppose America still use it? The honest answer is that the dollar's dominance isn't just political, it's infrastructural. When you price oil in dollars, you're not just changing a number on an invoice. You're plugging into a system of contracts, derivatives that have been built over 50 years. It's the same reason you still use certain apps long after better ones have been built. That said, the infrastructure of an alternative is now being built, and it's being built by the countries with the most to gain from dollar independence. Russia's response to Western sanctions has been tactical. Faced with being cut off from the dollar system, Moscow accelerates oil trade with China, settling transactions in yuan and rubles. It dumped nearly all of its dollar reserves and replaced them with gold, which now represents roughly half of Russia's accessible reserves. China's approach is more strategic and more patient. Beijing has been promoting yuan-denominated oil contracts. It has signed multi-year oil supply agreements with Saudi Arabia priced in yuan. And it has been quietly building something more significant than any individual deal: financial plumbing that bypasses the dollar system entirely. Project Enbridge is a cross-border payments platform built on central bank digital currencies. Its members are the central banks of China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the UAE. As of early 2026, it has processed over 4,000 transactions worth more than $55 billion, with China's digital yuan accounting for 95% of settlement volume. Meanwhile, the dollar share of global central bank reserves has fallen from 72% in 2000 to 56% as of early 2026, its lowest level in 30 years. That's not a crash, but it is a direction. It would be easy at this point to predict collapse. However, it would also be wrong. The dollar is not going to be replaced next year. It's probably not going to be replaced in the next decade in any dramatic sudden sense. What's changing now is that interests are shifting. Saudi Arabia has new customers. Russia has new payment rails. China is building infrastructure that doesn't require a single dollar to function. And every central bank that watched $300 billion get frozen in 2022 drew its own quiet conclusions. The system isn't dead, but for the first time in 50 years, the countries that sustain it are asking whether they have to. That's not a revolution. That's something more dangerous. That's a question with no clean answer.